This is Conrad Fisher with the final chapter of the endocrine physiology section. Bring it on home with female reproductive endocrine. Wait, stop. What's that up in the sky? Look, it's a menstrual cycle overview. The cycle is 28 days. That's an average person. You don't know how long it's going to be. Could be that it's 26 days for some and 30 days for others. On average, it's 28 days. We take the first day of bleeding to be the first day of the menstrual cycle because you can see it. You don't necessarily know when you're ovulating. 2, 4, 6, 8, time for us to ovulate, but you don't know when it's happening. But you do know when you're bleeding, and that's why we take day 1 as the first day of bleeding. The follicular phase is variable. The follicular phase is the amount of time it takes for the eggs to cook before they pop and you ovulate. Ovulation is in the middle, and luteal phase is based on the corpus luteum. It's called the corpus luteum because it's yellow, and it's yellow because it's greasy. It's chicharrones de ovaries. It's a shawarma ovary kebab, and that's because it's fried up with little tahini. It's got a little ghee on it. That's why it's yellow. Like ghee is yellow. It is luteal. It is the ghee phase, and that is because it's yellow from fat and tastiness. And then menstruation, menses, is when it starts again and you bleed. This is a follicle. A follicle is a fancy word for saying bubble. The ovary follicular phase is a bubble. The primary oocyte, you like that, something is called right in the center, the oocyte. You have theca cells on the outside and granulosa cells on the inside. The theca cells make the hormones up to androgens, up to DHEA, dehydroepiandrosterone, and then it gets metabolized by aromatase in the granulosa cells. That's the scent. The aroma of your femininity comes out of the granulosa cells where the aromatase is present. Let's be 100% clear on the phases of the menstrual cycle, starting with the follicular phase. Now, the follicular phase is variable. We don't know how long it takes when you plant seeds for them to sprout. They can all sprout the same day. They can all sprout at different days. We don't know which one. But we do know that the follicular phase, you start out with about 50 small oocytes and see how long it takes them to grow to the point where one of them will ovulate. Now, once they pop and they ovulate, then we know that they all wilt at the same time. That's why we know the luteal phase is always fixed at 14 days, because it's like a cut flower. It wears out, it expires. But the follicular phase is dominated by estrogen. Estrogen makes the endometrial lining cells grow. It doesn't put the sauce. The secretions, is from progesterone. But estrogen makes the endometrial lining cells grow. And then finally, you get to ovulation. Ovulation on average is day 14. Now, although there is an FSH surge too at the time of ovulation, we honestly do not know what to do with the FSH surge. We know it's there, but we don't know the functioning. But there's no discussing anything in the menstrual cycle until we're clear on the terminology of the phases. It starts with follicular phase, and then you ovulate, then it's the luteal phase. The luteal phase is characterized by progesterone. Now, it's not that there's no estrogen, it's just that there's less estrogen. There's less estrogen compared to the amount of progesterone. Progesterone makes it secretory. Estrogen makes the endometrial cells grow, but progesterone puts the secretions on them. It's kind of like saying one grows the salad, the other puts the salad dressing on it, and estrogen grows the salad, but progesterone is the salad dressing. It's the Alfredo sauce for your endometrial pasta with progesterone. Menses is a passive phenomenon, and it's based on withdrawal of hormone support. In other words, it is not an active phenomenon. In other words, when the corpus luteum wears out at 2 weeks, as it does, it goes bad like a yogurt goes bad. It expires. It doesn't last forever. And when the corpus luteum expires, then the progesterone and estrogen levels drop, and then it sloughs off, and away we go, down through the cervix, over the uterus and through the flow, the menstrual flow did grow, through the cervix and into the pad, out and away we go. It's an ovary, mother, it's an ovary. Yes, you got a corpus luteum with the granulosa and the theca lutein cells. Well, let's get the terminology right. The luteal cells are generally outside the granulosa cells, the corpus luteum. Well, not really. Actually, it all turns into a corpus luteum. You mean the theca and the granulosa cells end up turning the whole thing into a corpus luteum? Yes, they do. The theca and the granulosa cells both turn into the corpus luteum. In the follicular phase, they're separate. There's theca cells on the outside and granulosa cells on the inside. The theca cells take the precursors up to DHEA, dehydroepiandrosterone, which is the end product of the adrenal. But inside the ovary, when you have the granulosa cells, it has the aromatase that converts it one step further into estrogen. Here's an image you're going to get used to seeing throughout the entire female reproductive cycle. And part of the reason that it's such a challenging section for many students is that it goes in curves, and you see at one point the estrogen dominates the phase, and then the next point LH dominates it. The next point is progesterone. But we're all going to put it together, but let's give us the things right now that really help us to understand the seeming contradiction or changes that make the menstrual cycle so difficult. So the first part is that estrogen is inhibitory on the pituitary at the beginning of the cycle. And then, when it gets high enough, the estrogen level becomes stimulatory. Now you just have to accept that. You have to accept that when the estrogen level goes to a certain amount, it switches from inhibitory to stimulatory. Next, you have to accept that under the influence of that stimulatory estrogen, that the positive feedback loop now starts bumping up everything with luteinizing hormone. And under the influence of luteinizing hormone, everything turns into a corpus luteum. And that's why it's called luteinizing. That's why it's called luteinizing. That's why it's called luteinizing, because it's a corpus luteum. It's luteinizing. So that's one of the things that you're going to just have to be able to accept, that it turns everything into a corpus luteum. The next thing, corpus luteums make progesterone. That's another thing you have to accept. Corpus luteums make progesterone. So you have to accept that at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, estrogen is inhibitory on the pituitary, and then when its level goes high enough, it switches to stimulatory. It just happens. You have to accept that when it becomes stimulatory, there's an LH surge, which makes more estrogen. It's an LH surge, which makes more estrogen. And that creates an explosive event, because positive feedback loops are explosive. That's why there's so few of them. Finally, under the influence of luteinizing hormone, everything turns into a corpus luteum. And corpus luteums make progesterone. Estrogen switches from inhibitory to stimulatory. You just have to understand it. You have to accept it. Why? Because it does. When it becomes stimulatory, LH pops up, and LH turns everything, the theca and the granulosa cells, both into corpus luteal cells. You have to accept it. And corpus luteum switch from making estrogen to making predominantly progesterone. You have to accept it. Now, the key to long-term relationship is not that your partner does not have idiosyncrasies. You can't get a partner with no idiosyncrasies. What you need to do is have a partner in life whose idiosyncrasies you think are cute and adorable. Oh my God, you're so adorable when you switch from being inhibitory on the pituitary. You switch to being stimulatory, and then it's explosive. Oh my God, it's so wonderful. We take these theca and granulosa cells, 2 cells beat as 1. I got 2 types of cells, granulosa and theca, beat as 1, corpus luteum. And you just have to accept that. You have to accept it, because we don't know why. At what stage is this slide from? Is it the beginning part of the menstrual cycle? Is it the middle? Ovulation. Is it at the end, at the corpus luteum? How do you know that this is the beginning? First of all, there's a distinct theca on the left, granulosa on the right, theca on the left, granulosa on the right, so it can't be the corpus luteum, because there's distinct theca and granulosa cells. Number 2, you know it has to be beginning at the early part of the cycle, because the estrogen is inhibitory. The estrogen is inhibitory. And because the estrogen is inhibitory, shuts off LH and FSH because the estrogen is inhibitory. That's how you know it's at the beginning of the menstrual cycle. You know it's inhibitory because it's at the beginning of the menstrual cycle because it's inhibitory. Estrogen's acting as an inhibitory substance. Now, you see actually something called inhibin there, just above the estrogen on the right-hand side. An inhibin of which there's no deficiency disease, no excess disease, has one function in life, to inhibit predominantly FSH. The machinery of the receptor to the second messenger cyclic AMP to protein kinase, the receptor to the G protein to the second messenger cyclic AMP to protein kinase, that is the same mechanism that you see also in the adrenal, except that the gonads go further. It is the same mechanism, except gonads go further, and they have aromatase, so they go further. What are the peripheral effects of estrogen? Well, estrogen is produced by the granulosa cells during the follicular phase, and it stimulates female sex accessory organs, and it stimulates the sexual characteristics like breasts, wider hips, not having hair as much in your armpits, not as much on your face. And it makes the endometrial cells of the uterine mucosal layers grow, and it makes your mucus thin and watery so the sperm can go swim, get through there, little spermies. Now, ovulation happens because the theca and granulosa cells, under the influence of luteinizing hormone, are turning into a corpus luteum. It's generally 14 days into the cycle. Now, since the luteal phase is always fixed, constant at 14 days, we actually calculate the ovulation by taking the total cycle length and subtracting 14 days from when you start to bleed. You count backwards. Because we can't say how long the follicular phase is, because the follicular phase is variable. Follicular phase, estrogen, endometrial lining, variable. Follicular phase, estrogen, endometrial lining, thin mucus, not warm. Then when ovulation happens, we go pop, under the influence of LH. The wrong answer will be FSH as the cause for the ovulation. Now, positive feedback loops are explosive. That's why there's so few of them in the body. Even if I didn't tell you that this was during ovulation, you should be able to understand it, that it is. In other words, what if you're shown this image and they say, at what point is this in the menstrual cycle? You should still be able to say it's at ovulation, because there is where the estrogen says high circulating estrogen and now switches to being stimulatory. At the beginning part of the cycle, it is inhibitory on both FSH and LH. The reason that you ovulate is it turns into a positive feedback loop. Positive feedback is rare because it has to end in an explosive or ultimate ending event, mostly parturition, like giving birth, and ovulation. How come this is not the end of the cycle? Because the major product of the corpus luteum is progesterone. The major product of the corpus luteum is progesterone, and this is characterized by estrogen. So this cannot be the luteal phase because the major product is estrogen. It cannot be the beginning of the cycle because the estrogen is stimulatory. The luteal phase is fixed. The corpus luteum is when the theca and granulosa cells, under the influence of luteinizing hormone, are turning the whole machinery into a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is fixed because it will wear out at 2 weeks. It has to. If the corpus luteum doesn't wear out at 2 weeks, what will happen is that you will not have a dropping in the estrogen and progesterone levels. You'll never menstruate. So the luteal phase is the last 2 weeks of the cycle, and you take the total cycle length minus 14 days, and you figure out where you ovulated. Progesterone is the major product of the corpus luteum. Progesterone makes the secretions on the endometrial lining. Progesterone increases the body temperature. A woman shows that she's got an increase in 1 degree centigrade of her body temperature. What has happened? She's ovulated. It's from the progesterone. Progesterone makes you hungry. A man has metastatic cancer, and you, my father, on that sad height, rage against the dying of the light. Don't go gentle in that good night. Have some progesterone and have a bite. That's correct, because if you take people with cancer who are dying, you can stimulate their appetite. They're still going to die anyway, but they'll die eating and happy. The luteal phase reactions, you know that this is a corpus luteum and luteal phase reactions because there's LH receptors on everything. That's how you know it's a corpus luteum. That's how you know it's the luteal phase. Because there's LH receptors on everything, converting it into a progesterone-making apparatus. Now this picture, to be super precise, is when the theca and granulosa cells are preparing to become a corpus luteum. But you still know it has to be later in the cycle because there's LH receptors on everything, and the major product coming out the end will say progesterone. Well, what's the effect of progesterone? And increased plasma levels of progesterone. It causes the uterine endometrium to become secretory because the blastocyst needs a place to live. So on day 14, the egg ovulates, and she gets dressed up, and she goes to the distal third of that fallopian tube, and she's waiting for the guy. And then they have their first date in the distal third of the fallopian tube, and it's electric, and it's chemical, it's mechanical, it's anatomic, and it's beautiful, and they become part of each other like forever. Now they go on a 5-day honeymoon in the fallopian tube. But on day 20, they need to implant. Now you may implant and get an apartment, but without turning on the water and turning on the gas and getting the sheets and pillowcases and blankets, what's the point in having an apartment? Progesterone gets the sheet, the pillowcase, and the blankets and turns on the electric, the gas, and the water so you can make a happy home in the uterus. The progesterone makes the nutrients that you need for the blastocyst to stay alive. It also shuts off the other entry points into the cervix by making the mucus thick so nothing else can go in. And it's thermogenic. You can actually tell when someone's ovulated by asking them to measure their basal body temperature. Progesterone makes you warmer. Now, the life of the corpus luteum is finite. It has a 14-day lifespan. And the corpus luteum is very responsive to luteinizing hormone. As a matter of fact, corpus luteum is under direct control of luteinizing hormone until you give birth. Well, you see, if you don't have luteinizing hormone, you need something else to take over. And that's where we get beta-HCG. It takes over for luteinizing hormone. Progesterone is a negative feedback inhibition on luteinizing hormone out of the pituitary, and that's why it is that the progesterone that the corpus luteum makes shuts off luteinizing hormone so that the corpus luteum will eventually make less progesterone. This is a normal feedback inhibition cycle. So the corpus luteum lasts for only 2 weeks, and then when the corpus luteum wears out, the progesterone, estrogen levels start to fall, and eventually, if the progesterone falls, you stop the secretions, and if the estrogen falls, you can't maintain the cells. Now, do not get distressed about learning about which is estradiol, which is estrone, estriol. They're all estrogens, and I would not torture yourself too much with trying to learn too much of the differences between the names of them. They're all about the same. They're all estrogens. Menstruation is due to lack of the gonadal sex hormones. Now, what that means is that when progesterone drops, the secretions go away. Uh-oh, not a happy time to live in the endometrium. And when the estradiol goes away, uh-oh, it sloughs off. And it's a passive event by loss of the nutrition. It's basically like shutting off the water to your front lawn. It wilts. It wilts. Back to our periods and the menstrual period. At menses, at the end, progesterone, estradiol, estrogen levels drop because they are made by corpus luteum. When the corpus luteum expires, progesterone and estrogen go away. This is saying the corpus luteum expires, estrogen and progesterone drop, and the endometrial lining sloughs off.